Welcome to Unedited, our fortnightly podcast where we explore the opportunities and challenges the retail industry is facing. From fashion, beauty and homeware, myself, Grace Hill, will be chatting to leading experts in the industry to shed light on how retailers can create a brighter future. So on today's episode, we will be unpacking how retailers can optimize their investment in AI. But to begin with, if you want to learn more about AI generally, this is a topic that we have covered on a previous episode. So I'd really recommend listening to our episode that we had with Alejandro Giacometti, a data scientist at Edited. But before we get into the episode, I think it's really exciting to make a very important announcement in Edited's future, which is the acquisition of Dynamic Action. So with the accelerated shift towards e-commerce, two leaders in AI-led retail automation, which is Edited and Dynamic Action, have joined forces to centralize business and market data into one place. So together, we'll close the loop between information and action and equip retailers with the insights that they need to make better data-backed decisions. With the first fully integrated retail automation system, Edited and Dynamic Action combine global market data alongside data from the supply chain ecosystem for rapid insights. In a tumultuous climate, this will help empower retailers to move with precision and agility whilst taking the risk out of retailing. So I am thrilled to introduce you to Michael Ross, who is our SVP of Retail Science here at Edited. So Michael was formerly the co-founder and chief scientist of Dynamic Action, which, as I've mentioned, is a leader in big data analytics and AI for retail, which has just recently been acquired by Edited. He's also a non-exec director at Sainsbury's Bank, M. Brown PLC, and is a visiting lecturer at London Business School in AI and Applied Data Science. And he was previously the co-founder and CEO of figleaves.com, starting his career at McKinsey, consulting in the early days of the internet. Welcome, Michael. How are you doing today?
I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm doing very well.
Amazing. And whereabouts are you for our listeners?
I am currently in sunny Brighton, very windy, but next to the sea. So again, very pleasant this time of year.
How lovely. There's quite a few Edited members based down in Brighton. It's a popular destination, but amazing. So obviously, Michael, you have an extensive background across retail and technology. We'd love it for our listeners if you could give them a brief overview of your career so far.
Sure. So start quite a long way back. So I'm getting old. I've got a degree in maths. So I guess I was studying sort of maths and statistics now over 30 years ago. And interestingly, a lot of what we'll get onto, a lot of what is considered sort of AI today was simply statistics 30 years ago. So my background, I then did something entrepreneurial. When I graduated, I set up a business publishing maps back in the early 90s. I then joined McKinsey & Company in 1994. And I guess I was in sort of right place at the right time. And I essentially became McKinsey's internet person in London. It was right at the beginning. So just when Amazon had launched in 94 and people obviously were talking about the internet. And so I became involved in all sorts of interesting projects with newspapers, with broadcasters, with retailers, trying to work out, what this internet was, what it was going to be good for. And I spent 5 years at McKinsey and then really got caught up in the sort of first dot-com boom in the late 90s and left McKinsey to effectively co-found the business that became figleaves.com. So I set up figleaves.com, became CEO in 1999. We launched pretty much exactly the same time as ASOS, Nukes, and Net-a-Porter. We were all sort of founded in the late 90s. I remember very vividly in 2001, Fig Leaves was about 3 or 4 times the size of ASOS. By 2004, I think ASOS was about 10 times the size of Fig Leaves. So, but sort of lived through a very brief period where we were much bigger than ASOS. But I was ran Fig Leaves for 7 years and then exited Fig Leaves in about 2005, 2006, and then co-founded a business called Ecomera. And Ecomera was a part technology platform offering, and we ended up running the e-commerce for the likes of Asda and House of Fraser. And then we were also a data business, and we recognized that retailers were sort of struggling to make sense of all of the data that their digital businesses were generating. We ended up selling the e-commerce side of the business and sort of spinning off the data business into a business that became Dynamic Action. And so then I spent subsequent 7 years building the Dynamic Action business. And then we were acquired by Edited earlier in 2021.
I mean, what a broad range of experiences as well. And I feel like the fact that you've not only been a retail CEO, but you've also got that experience in consultancy, but also the background in tech as well, which I feel like makes a pretty interesting skill set and experience to draw upon. And I guess, ultimately retail has undeniably gone through major changes over the past 18 months, which has expedited the future of retail. I guess from your expert opinion, what are the main drivers of the future of retail, would you say?
So, look, it's a big question. And I guess it's trying to, answering this sort of question, it's always, my mind is like, where do you anchor? Where do you start? I would typically start with technology, because it's technology, whether we like it or not, it's technology that is the sort of catalyst of transformation. I think technology is both transforming how customers are behaving. So customers are sort of voting with their mice or with their feet. The shifting customer behavior, again, is, as you pointed out, has been massively accelerated and amplified by COVID. It was obviously shifting before then. But equally, technology is changing what happens sort of inside businesses. And I see two types of change. The first one is what I would call digitalization. And I describe digitalization, which is converting processes that were formerly physical processes into digital processes. And again, we're all familiar with that as consumers, but equally inside the enterprise, inside businesses, increasingly their worlds are being digitalized. And then there's digitization, which is things that were moving from sort of analog, i.e., on pieces of paper or data that was simply lost, that data is now being collected at the point of consumption. So you sort of digital exhaust, essentially, as more and more processes are digitalized, you get this wonderful digital exhaust of data. So you start off with technology, and then that's leading to these sort of two forces of digitalization and digitization. Okay, well, so what? What I think that is, so if you're a retailer, you wake up one day and you've got data that you've never had before. You've got sort of tsunami of data coming at you. You've also got levers that you've never had before. Your ability to pull levers, whether it's pricing levers or personalization levers or managing sort orders, or whether it's on digital marketing, you've got these much, much more fine-grained levers than you've had in the past. As retailers being atomized, that massively complicates what the world for a retailer looks like. So again, let me take one example. One retailer we're working with, they are moving from saying, we set a single price for a dress and then maybe we change it. We have a couple of markdowns at the end of the season. We are now going to move to personalized promotions by SKU, by store, enabling customers to walk into a store, scan products, and get a personalized price. So we maybe moved from setting, a few hundred or a few thousand prices a few times a season to setting millions of prices, complete explosion of complexity. Yeah. And we might change that, 10 times a day. So then moving from one or two big decisions a year to literally millions of decisions a week. So this, I think, is the world that retailers are facing into. If they apply old retailing logic to this new world, just massively suboptimizing, leaving money on the table. And when your competitors are being much more agile and nimble, it's not a winning formula. And so what does that mean? That means you need to think of AI and algorithms as your new colleagues. And it's not that they're going to replace humans, but they're going to amplify humans, and they are going to take sort of cognitive burden, both in terms of solving the problems and then how executing at scale. So I think, there's a lot of elements to that. But if I say, fundamentally, what does the future of retail look like? I would say it's got sort of three core building blocks. The first one is what I would call decision re-engineering. Retailers needing to rethink the fundamentals of how they make decisions, whether that's the frequency with which they make decisions, the granularity, the specificity of how they make decisions, or the logic of how they make decisions, number one. Secondly, management is going to need to change. When you move from making a human level number of decisions to millions of decisions, the whole question of decision management and like what the role of the humans and the machines are, that needs to change. And I think and we look forward to a future of these sort of hybrid teams of humans and machines. And then finally, how you evaluate performance, everything to do with metrics and understanding how retail's formed is going to change. And fundamentally, old retail, you could look at aggregated averages, you could look at your store like for likes, and you could really understand how the business was performing. The nature of retail, the way it was nicely sort of quantized into individual stores, made it relatively easy to actually understand performance. The problem is once you get into sort of omni-channel retail, customer-centric retail, and you've got millions of customers and millions of keywords, looking at aggregated averages no longer gives you any idea of what's actually happening. So there needs to be this kind of complete reassessment of how the retailers actually understand and evaluate their performance.
I think you've said a number of super interesting points there. And I'm imagining merchandisers or planners listening to you speak, Michael, and think, oh my goodness, I cannot imagine doing promotions that are personalized and may impact millions of price changes a day. And I think it goes back to, as you said, having machines or technology almost on your org chart and kind of playing to the strengths and weaknesses of each, right? As you said, humans are still very important in the role of retail, but it's actually what is the most effective and efficient way of combining the two for ultimately better business performance, right? I love the concept of kind of a retail trading floor. And I think luckily, having had exposure to some of the most successful retailers in the world, that's definitely kind of the type of a model that you can see them starting to adopt and how that is breeding success. But I wanted to talk about a recent article that was published in the Harvard Business Review that was co-written by yourself. It was called Why You Aren't Getting More from Your Marketing AI. It would be great if you could kind of unpack maybe for our listeners the main issues that you investigated in the article.
Firstly, even in the article, it's marketing in its most general sense. And certainly all the principles actually really apply to, frankly, a very broad type of decisions, as I'll sort of explain. So I think the first thing to sort of unpack this is to start with decisions and to say, look, as I said sort of earlier, one of the key fundamentals for retail now is to look at how retailers make their core decisions and how all this new technology allows them to make decisions differently. What sort of decisions are we talking about? Whether that's pricing decisions, first price or markdown price, promotional decisions, digital marketing decisions, allocation decisions, replenishment decisions. These are the sort of core day-to-day trading decisions that retailers are making. And I would say all of those types of decisions share common characteristics. Retailers have choices. They're decisions where, you might have a choice of one or two things. Is it sort of yes or no, or one of three or four things? Or it might be you can choose any number. You can choose any number from 1 to 100. So the retailer has to sort of make a decision out of a number of choices. And there's uncertainty. There is uncertainty. Now, there are certain other decisions we could get onto that don't have inherent uncertainty. But the sort of decisions that we're most interested in is where there's some underlying, whether it's price elasticity, I want to mark down, I want to understand what happened to the pricing, whether it's understanding customer intent, for example, or predicting customer churn. These are the sorts of decisions where there's some underlying, the state of the world is not known with certainty. And so when you think about these decisions, there's a lot of thinking actually quite old from the sort of 50s and 60s called decision analysis, which is how you analyze these decisions and you break a decision down into thinking through, well, what are the options? Given every decision, what are the options? What's the uncertainty? Given the uncertainty and the possible decisions, well, what are the possible outcomes? And then deciding on what will, given a retailer's objective, that will then inform what decision you will make. Now, most retailers, for most decisions, they don't think of the structure like that. It's much more intuitive, but what's going on is that's, I would say, is the sort of scaffolding that sits underneath the decisions, is sort of uncertainty and choices. And the decision logic is then, well, how do I make these choices given uncertainty? What we saw in this article is essentially the question we were kind of grappling with is, well, businesses are deploying AI. And in that context, when we're using the term AI, we're really talking about the sort of machine learning part of AI. And when we talk about machine learning, we're talking about machine learning as a prediction technology. So we're basically saying, look, businesses are using AI to make predictions. And whether that's about customer churn, or whether that's about price elasticity, or whether that's what next season's color is going to be, AI is AI. They're using AI to predict things. But one key insight is that we say a prediction is not a decision. Just because I can predict that a customer has a 70% likelihood of churning, or just because I predict that, I can predict the price elasticity of a particular product or category, that doesn't tell you what decision to make. A decision is a combination of some prediction and some human judgment. And so we thought, again, one thing that I think people get easily confused about is they think that AI is the decision. Well, doesn't the machine just tell me what to do? And the answer is no. A machine is, making a prediction, and then that's got to be combined with human judgment. What is the decision the human is trying to make, and what is the human trying to optimize? And those are things that actually are not things that machines know about. They don't understand whether this week we're trying to drive profit, or this week we're trying to get rid of old stock, or whether we're just trying to drive revenue. So what we observed is there are three things that typically go wrong. We call them the 3 A's. We had to come up with 3 things that began with an A. So we called them the 3 A's, which we thought of as the sort of typical failures we see: alignment, asymmetry, and aggregation. So alignment is a sort of failure to ask the right question. A good example of this is the world is very keen on building churn models at the moment. Most retailers are saying, we've got to predict churn, we've got to predict churn. And when you drill, and it's not that that's a bad thing to do, but again, predicting churn is not a decision. It's not that you suddenly wake up one morning, you've got a churn prediction, your business is going to be no better as a result of that. What you care about is making interventions that will reduce churn. That's the business decision. The business decision is, can we make some interventions, whether that's a promotional intervention or a messaging or something, some mechanic that reduces our churn? And so, okay, now we're getting closer to, okay, we need a business decision that says what we're trying to do is actually increase our customers' profitability by making an intervention, and we have a churn prediction that will inform that decision. But even that realizes what you see is we asked the wrong question, because think about a good analogy is in voting. We're all familiar with all the craziness around political advertising. And whatever color you are, if you're into political advertising, political advertisers aren't interested in predicting whether you're going to vote Labour or Conservative. What they're interested in is, can we persuade you to change your mind? They're interested in the swing voters, because the people who have made their mind either way, frankly, you're just wasting money. And so similarly, back to our churn problem, what you're really interested in is not really predicting who's going to churn, but you want to predict who's influenceable. And they're the people that you actually want to invest money on. And so that, for me, is a really good example of alignment. Like, actually, how do you predict the right thing? Asymmetry is another really interesting problem, because in many decisions that I guess as consumers we used to, let's take, a prediction that Alexa might make when you ask for a song, or image recognition on Google. There's enormous amounts of cleverness and complexity in the voice processing and the natural language processing. But at the point that Alexa is making a recommendation, it's simply picking the song that it thinks has the highest probability of a match. And generally, the value of being right and the cost of being wrong are pretty symmetrical. You know what? If I ask for a song and it plays the wrong song, no one gets hurt. It's not the end of the world. But there are lots and lots of decisions where actually the value of being right and the cost of being wrong are very unequal. Let me give you an example in fraud. You're a retailer and someone places a £1,000 order. You know, if you accept the order and it turns out to be fraudulent, you're going to lose your £1,000 or the cost of the goods. But if you reject the order, you're potentially annoying or losing massively high value customer. And so making that trade-off and understanding what the right cutoff is, you know, if you have a model that's predicting whether an order is fraudulent, the cutoff is certainly not 50-50. You know, you have to be much more thoughtful about, well, what's the right, you know, what's the value of being right and the cost of being wrong. And then the final thing we see people going wrong is sort of aggregation of people, you know, not recognizing in this very, very atomized world that you can make decisions at a much more granular level. And again, I'll bring this to life with a couple of examples. You know, I see businesses building customer lifetime prediction models at an individual customer level, but still, when they come to take action, they take action across 7 segments. So they're making these very granular decisions, but based on a single customer lifetime value target or a single cost of sale target. And so generally what we're seeing is just a failure to use the sort of the new mechanics of retail to make much more, whether it's more frequent or more granular decisions.
That was really interesting. And I know that obviously you had highlighted at the start, Michael, that obviously this came through kind of a marketing lens, but actually everything you've said pertains to retail too from your article. And obviously, as you've already mentioned, kind of one of the key takeaways from your study is that businesses, you know, fail to ask the right question and end up directing AI to solve kind of the wrong problem. And you gave the example of kind of the customers obviously wanting to reduce churn, but actually focusing on those customers that maybe were influenceable in able to retain their business. Why is it that this happens? And how can retailers ensure that this doesn't happen within their business?
I think this stuff is genuinely very hard. I think the technology is complicated, you know, and when I say technology, I mean the language of AI, the art of what's now possible. You know, I've been doing this a long time. The older I get, you know, the less I realize I know. I think Satya Nadella expressed this very well at Microsoft. And he said, you know, he wanted to turn Microsoft into a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture and ensure people have a growth mindset and recognize the world is just too complex for senior leaders to think they know the answers to everything. And that's a really wonderful aspiration, because I think the biggest barrier is for senior leaders who've spent careers in retail to admit that they just don't know the answers to some of these questions. So I think that's fundamental. Sort of the concept comes from that, I would describe as psychological safety. This is, again, a concept Google has been big champions of, to sort of create an environment that gives people confidence to say, look, we know there are opportunities. We don't know what they are, but we've got to create space to think differently, to ask different questions. People are worried about change. I mean, change has always been challenging. And so the businesses, I think, that do really well and the people who do really well are the ones who create an environment of openness to think differently and willingness to say that there's no sacred cows. We've got to be willing to look at how we make decisions, challenge the status quo, challenge silos. One client I was talking to recently, and we were talking about silos, and he made this great comment, and he said, Michael, all the silos are smart. Every silo is individually really, really smart. But a lot of the really hard stuff is the stuff that crosses silos. Let me bring this to life. You know, merchandisers own inventory and pricing and promotions. and the marketing team own all the digital marketing spend and what goes on Google Shopping. If you're optimizing merchandising, pricing and promotions independently from Google Shopping, you can't possibly get to the right answer. You have to look at this end to end. You have to sort of think through what is the optimal mix. When do we increase the exposure of products on digital marketing? When do we change the price? When do we do both? And yet getting that collaboration and getting merchandisers to be interested in digital marketing and getting digital marketing professionals to be interested in merchandising is not straightforward. Ultimately, this comes down to people. It comes down to people's willingness to think differently. And I think that comes down to the sort of leadership of these businesses creating the space for their teams to think differently.
Totally. I think it's something that I've faced a huge amount, and my team has, in terms of kind of battling with that psychological safety and, humans' natural reaction tendency to kind of fear the possibilities of technology. And as you said, it really is important to come from leadership and to kind of foster that growth mindset. And I feel like it's so interesting kind of comparing and contrasting different businesses that we've worked with. And actually, one of our customers, even at the most senior level, they kind of were very open and admitted that they didn't understand the possibilities or how it was that we collected our data, edited, and what the impact of that could be. But they were very open to it, and they were very interested and excited. And you could tell that then funneled down to the rest of the team and ultimately led to much better decision making versus that fear of what could be and actually resisting the change. But obviously, you guys cite a survey by Sloan Management Review and the Boston Consulting Group, where they found fewer than 40% of customers who have invested in AI had actually seen business gains from it in the previous 3 years. So I guess, how can retailers, marketers, data science teams communicate better and take steps to avoid these pitfalls that you set out in your paper to ensure that they are getting those returns that they expect from their AI effort?
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly AI, was the shiny new thing that everyone had to sort of dumb. If you had to be picking the box to be doing something that you could point to and say it was AI. I think the key for me is sort of think big, but start small. You don't start with a big grand vision, and you don't start with the data. You start with looking at a decision, and decisions that have a big revenue attached to them or a big cost attached to them, and a willingness to say, how can we make this decision differently? Not perfectly, but differently and better. And I think that then perfect becomes the enemy. And then how can we use AI and automation to make decisions more efficiently, more frequently, and more surgically at a sort of lower level of granularity? Or where can we apply new logic? And there's no right answer. It's not like you should do one before the other. You just need the curiosity and the creativity to look at decisions and then go on a journey to say, right. And I think very similar to people's approach to agile technology, I think this is really about agile business. It's about how do we increase the pace and agility of making these sorts of decisions.
So, Michael, according to a study by Juniper Research, global retail spending on AI will reach $7.3 billion annually by 2022. However, retailers have always been or tended or have a reputation to being slower to adopt technologies in comparison to other industries. Why do you think that is? And what are some of the kind of common mistakes and misconceptions that you've seen when it comes to retailers' application of AI?
It's just funny. I mean, I'm always a little skeptical of hearing these sort of big round numbers of spend. And when people talk about AI, I mean, pretty much every software on the planet today will claim to do something related to AI, whatever it is they do, because that needs to be fixed. So I start off with a sort of slightly sort of skeptical tone with all of this type of research. I think when we think about AI, it covers such a broad spectrum of applications. So at one extreme, we all experience as consumers, whether it's voice recognition on Alexa or natural language search or chatbots, these sort of interface AI that are increasingly common and obviously increasingly work very, very, very well. So to some extent, these are now available as services. So, most retailers, relatively easy to deploy better on-site search, for example, or to start deploying chatbots to take some of the burden off customer service. And I wouldn't say these are wildly, you now might consider these just mainstream software. If you're going to a call center vendor or you're going to any on-site search vendor, it's like, well, bingo, you've just deployed some AI, but it's not as though the retailer or retailers had to sort of make any massive change to their business to do that. It's just sort of, let's call that's AI as part of sort of business as usual. I think where it gets more complicated is when you get into sort of more, let's say, the more sort of machine learning aspect of AI, which I think of as AI as a prediction technology. And in that regard, retailers there's lots of predictions that underpin retail. How do we set prices? How many units of something should we order? When do we mark down? How much do we mark down? When do we send a promotion to customers? These are decisions that have uncertainty and where a kind of a machine learning prediction can potentially help retailers make better decisions. And I think the challenge is that when you think about, this sort of machine learning, and you think about different domains that machine learning gets deployed, there's so many elements of it in terms of what competitors are doing, what's going on in the market. They're just sort of unknown and probably unknowable. So the uncertainty in retail is very, very, very different. And therefore, the complexity of applying AI and machine learning to these types of decisions are sort of quite different type of problem than a lot of the sort of mainstream AI that we're all now used to. What does that mean? Look, it means, for most retailers, and let's take most successful retailers, they found a very successful formula. And if you look at whether it's the likes of, let's take Zara or H&M, let's pick on Zara. There was a period of 4 or 5 years where Zara was opening a store every day, opened something like 1,500 stores in a 4-year period. It's an incredibly complex execution, but it's a very, very simple idea. We find a store format that works and then we open more stores. And I think that's probably one of the characteristics of successful retailers. In store-based retail, the whole challenge was around finding a format that worked and then opening more stores and then being absolutely sort of militaristic about execution and doing the same thing every day in every store. What we're now finding with digital retail growth is driven by customer acquisition and retention. The complexity of retail, the growth model, the uncertainty of these decisions means that it's extremely challenging for retailers to sort of adapt to this new world. And I think that the consequence is that understanding how you should actually deploy sort of machine learning in a way that drives business value is just a hard problem. And that it is easy to do badly, it's easy to do things that don't add value or destroy value. And retailers don't like that. They're cautious. I would say good retailers are often very simplistic in their approach, and that's not a negative. They like keeping things simple. Good retailers always been simple.
There's this cautiousness amongst the industry because, as you said, there are examples of where it has gone so wrong. For those, maybe people that are listening or retailers that are new to adopting AI, where would you kind of recommend that they start and why, to make sure that they don't have those same pitfalls that other, retailers have or face the same casualties?
Again, great question. I mean, for me, the mantra is to sort of think big but start small. And where would you start? Start with decisions that either are costing you, either where there's basically big dollar value. And that can either be where you're spending a lot of money, so where there's a lot of cost, or that's touching a lot of revenue. Number one. I think the second one, and this is, I think, probably the hardest step, understand how bad things are today. So one retailer I was talking to recently, and they were thinking about deploying some more sophisticated AI to drive their on-site orders, to improve when you search for dresses on their website, the order in which the dresses are sort of returned. And they had a sort of very vague objective. They sort of said, well, we just think we want to improve the customer experience. The problem is if you don't have a clear problem you're trying to solve, it's very hard to understand, one, how you can ask the AI sort of the right questions, but also, it's hard to recognize success if you're not clear on the problem in the first place. So what we got to is actually, and this is again, I think, sort of culturally hard, is to let's go and analyze current performance of this sort of on-site search to work out, well, how well is it performing? So that raised the question, well, how do we evaluate it? And the business up until this point, well, they said, look, we focus on click-through rate. Success is, are people clicking on the search results, which doesn't sound like a stupid way to evaluate a search engine. But what it turns out is that if you focus just on click-through rate, the AI is going to basically promote all the products that are typically bestsellers, popular, you're going to sell anyway, that lots of people like clicking on. And what you end up with is a massive rump of products at the end of the season that haven't sold and you need to mark down. And so actually what we analysed is, well, what percentage of the range was actually never getting viewed? But we found that if a business with something like $100 million of inventory, something like $20 million of inventory was actually not getting viewed at all, or was getting, less than 5 views. So suddenly you realize, okay, now we've got a real problem to go after. The issue is that we are overexposing a set of bestsellers that frankly we're going to sell out anyway. And we're underexposing this sort of underclass of products that can get buried. The analogy would be, they're at the back of the store and no one ever sees them. And then, we've got to mark them all down to get rid of them. So if one can frame a problem, and again, in the example of this specific retailer, it was a very easy to quantify problem. We could see that there was tens of millions of dollars of inventory. They could see that their markdowns, were increasing over time, the end of season markdowns. And we could see that this problem was worth about, $5 or $6 million a season. So the nice thing about that is we could then say, okay, well, that allows us to, one, recognize success, because if we can start seeing that number going down, we're happy. But also we could be confident that, a $1-2 million improvement would be very meaningful in the scale of the business. And then the problem became, what we then talk about is, well, how do you then translate that business problem, this sort of over and underexposed products, into a data problem? How do you translate that? And that, again, I think is the next really hard challenge. The business people have a real intuitive then sense of the business problem, but they need to translate that into something that the data scientists can go and solve. And this is a topic, wearing my edited dynamic action hat, this is a problem we think about a lot, which is how do you effectively rank products to optimize profitability and profitability across the season? So that for me is an example of how do you start small? You start with a bite-sized problem. You start with something really specific that the business can understand. You quantify it. You can see that, you are wasting money or missing opportunities today. And then you can translate it into a kind of a roadmap where you can fix, start small and just fix incrementally, recognizing, that you can see value along the way.
I feel like that's fascinating as well, how you gave insight into the fact that actually the original click-through challenge and measure of success actually wasn't ever going to be a successful measure of success because of the influence that AI was already having on that measure, which is super, super interesting. So obviously you've mentioned your experience at Dynamic Action and Edited and kind of the problems and the opportunities that we face with our customer base. And obviously a huge part of our work is helping our customers really understand market opportunities. How do you feel from your experience of working in retail and working with technology, how retailers could leverage AI to expand into maybe other markets or new categories or even completely new verticals?
So I think most retailers sort of typically are thinking on different horizons. There's a relatively standard way of thinking about the world in terms of what's sort of Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. Horizon 1 is how do we optimize business as usual? Then horizon 2 is how do we go into adjacencies, maybe, adding a category. And then horizon 3, maybe going into something completely sort of new type of business. And I think when you start thinking about new categories and new geographies, that always comes with lots of uncertainty and complexity. So again, wherever I see uncertainty and complexity, you think, okay, well, how can we use data and AI to sort of reduce that? Every time as a business you have choices to make, you think, well, we should be able to use data and apply AI techniques to reduce risk or quantify the uncertainty that will help us make a decision. So taking some of the examples, one of the things we do a lot of, let's say with new categories or increasing categories, is to look at a business and look at it firstly through the lens of customers and saying, okay, we can now understand customer profitability at an individual customer level, and we can start looking at category performance, not just through the P&L lens, through how much profit did this category generate, but what was the customer impact? And one of my favorite stories of this was from Fig Leaves. And I was running Fig Leaves, and we were a multi-brand retailer. We sold 300 brands. And one of our brands, we were the exclusive retailers in Europe of a brand called Perla, which, for those unfamiliar, is a very expensive Italian lingerie brand. Now, what was interesting about La Perla is when you looked, in fact, I remember a conversation with one of our buyers, and she came to me and said, Michael, we need to delist La Perla. It's a disaster. It's got a very low margin. It's got very, very high returns rate. Because of the photography standards La Perla set, it costs us a fortune to photograph it, loses us money. We just lost money last season on La Perla. And I said, well, we need to look at this from a customer perspective. And when we looked at it from a customer perspective, what we could see, it was the brand first purchased by our most valuable customers. It was actually a brilliant, brilliant brand for acquiring and then also retaining customers. We didn't make money from their purchases of La Perla, but we made a fortune from their purchases of all sorts of other things. But La Perla was a brand that brought them in. And you could see that very, very clearly. They were going to Google, they were searching for La Perla, they were coming to the website, they were buying La Perla, but then they also bought lots of other stuff. So this then, Fig Leaves led us down a really, really interesting route of looking at every brand and category from a customer perspective. Now, Fig Leaves was pre-edited. What we are now able to do is, having sort of looked at a kind of retailer's business in this sort of brand perspective, we can then say, well, let's now go and look at competitive positioning. If we can see brands or categories that are, let's call them must-win, because they are super, super important from a customer perspective, well, what's the competitive positioning? Where is it that we are, market leader, or where is it that we can see a new competitor that is now expanding their range in this brand or expanding their range in this category, and therefore one can take, make some sort of intervention, either try and get exclusivity or expand the range or improve availability or whatever it is. So I think the opportunity here is around bringing, the data together from customer data, from market data, to help retailers give them confidence to make much sort of faster and better decisions around expansion and where to play and how to play.
I love that La Perla example, because I think that's an obvious example where if you hadn't have analysed the data through the customer's lens, as a commercial-minded retail professional, you may have decided actually that you were going to exit that brand and it was loss-making, and that actually, ultimately, as you could tell from looking into the data, that there was ultimately much greater gains on a bigger scale of having that brand within your kind of portfolio and house. So that's really interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of other examples of where, different brands offered a different element of business payback at the end of the day.
No, without question. So some other great examples. We did some work with a beauty retailer, and I remember again this very, very clearly. We looked at sort of they were selling 40 brands, and we looked at sort of an analysis of brands. Not only were we looking at the sort of extent to which they acquired or retained customers, we also looked at brand addictiveness, which was what was customers propensity to buy brands or products multiple times. Again, think about a beauty product. If we sold 1,000 units of something, is it that 1,000 people have bought it once, which is not great? Or is it that 100 people have bought it once, so 50 people have bought it twice, but actually 10 people have bought it 10 times, and you recognise that they're a much better sign if people have a propensity to repeat. And what we found, again, was fascinating, was we found some quite niche brands that their highest value customers were addicted to. So these were brands that weren't even, never really came up in their bestseller list, but you could see they were bringing back, or the hypothesis was they were bringing back customers who overall were worth tens of thousands of pounds to them. What was interesting in that case, you're rarely saying something to retailers that they're saying, I would never have thought of that in a million years. What you're often saying is, but I had a hunch, but I didn't actually realize how valuable that was. And it was my hunch, and now I can quantify it. I can get the whole exec team behind it. So I think this idea of sort of quantified gut instinct and allows the intuition of retailers to scale, not been reliant on particularly unique individuals, I think is a really nice, for me, it's one of the really important themes that I don't see a world in retail where machines take over. We see humans and machines, working as a team. And actually, you need to think about machines as new team members, not as people who are going to threaten.
Totally. It's like what you said earlier about it's like amplifying the efforts and the opportunities, right, that you wouldn't ever be able to do. I know within the Dynamic Action platform, you have the opportunity to use your affinities tool and talking about brand addictiveness, what else is it that they're buying, or what products are they buying together? And then being able to kind of maximize and build upon that, which with gut instinct, you may know, but now you have the hard facts to be able to then channel your investment and your resource into that, and the payback that you'll get from time, but also at the bottom line will hopefully prove the huge gains in the value of implementing technology like this. So obviously with your experiences with both Dynamic Action and Edited, do you have any stories or tangible examples of where kind of a retailer has successfully applied AI to drive sales and growth?
So look, I think every retailer's starting point is different. And one's always cautious of making generalization. I think one thing I would immediately pick on is revenue growth. I think one of the biggest opportunities we see is to focus more on profit than revenue. It's always a sort of famous quote in retail that revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash is reality.
I love that.
It's really true. And it's so easy to drive revenue and not drive profit. I mean, interestingly, in physical retail, and I think this is where a lot of these sort of ideas come from, physical retail was generally a fixed cost business. You have rents, you've got rate, you've got electricity, you've got your staff costs. But thereafter, your trading costs are, you get the right structure right. It's very hard not to make money historically. I think what you find in the digital world increasingly is there are lots and lots of variable costs. There's all the variable marketing costs, where it's order or click. There's the picking and packing costs. There's the dispatch costs. There's the return costs. What you see in the digital world is it's very, very easy to drive revenue and not drive profit. And the reason I say this is because when I think about the clients I'm working with and have worked with over the years, the answer is often not about increasing revenue. So let me give some examples. Eventually, it was a few years ago, and this one customer had bought 11,000 copies of Call of Duty. And this was a business that it was a multi-channel retailer, and it was selling PS4 games and sort of PlayStation games. And as a loss leader, which was very, very common, probably still is common, but when the new game launched, they were being sold in stores as a way to bring customers into the store. And in store, I think they had limited customers to, maybe buying 5 copies in one order. Online, they had put a similar limit that you could only buy 5 in an order. They hadn't limited the number of orders that a customer could make. So this customer had made 2,000 orders for 5 PS4 games at a time that no doubt he was then selling on market stalls or internationally. So this was a brilliant example where the guy running the category was getting patted on the back because he'd driven millions of pounds of revenue. But in fact, I mean, it was a PS4 charity. I mean, they were just giving stuff away. And so I think that's another example where we could identify a kind of both quantify losses and also then have a very direct action attached to it. Another great example on a similar theme was a US fashion retailer. And we found a set of customers who returned 100% of everything they ever bought. We called them free rental customers because they were sort of typically buying on a Wednesday or Thursday and then sending back after the weekend. And one customer in particular, I think had spent $100,000. It was a gold customer because, of course, the gold, silver, and bronze was based on their revenue, not their profitability. So they were rewarding that customer with lots of free beers and additional promotions, and the customer was sending back everything they were buying. So that's, for me, another really, really good example. And then I mentioned earlier the idea of these sort of sort orders and sort of under and over exposure. That is, for me, again, a recent example where most retailers are sending a product feed to Google Shopping. Google Shopping, for a typical retailer, is an increasingly large percentage of their paid marketing spend is on Google Shopping. And again, it's difficult for retailers to send their entire product feed to Google because that is technically much the easiest thing to do. However, what we could see is that there was a huge amount of spend on products that were either completely sold out, that were about to sell out, that were very, very fragmented and therefore weren't converting, or never existed and had just ended up in the product feed through technical errors. At an overall level, the Google Shopping spend looked pretty efficient. So if you looked at an aggregate level and you said, well, we spent X million on Google Shopping and we generated 5X, marketing team was saying, no, great result, we hit our numbers. Actually, when you looked at a kind of more atomic level and you said, well, hold on a second, yes, overall it's been efficient, but we could have saved millions of pounds and achieved the same top-line revenue, and actually start aligning Google Shopping to our inventory position and saying, well, how can we actually use Google to help drive sell-through versus just simply exposing products that are going to sell out anyway? That led to a much more thoughtful and constructive conversation. What we ended up with was what I would describe as profit optimized product feeds, where you were sending every hour to Google a product feed that was aligned to driving total business profit, not purely on a sort of a siloed marketing outcome.
I think that's a great example of demonstrating how, as you said, in silo, these metrics can look great and can look fantastic and you're achieving your objectives. But actually, when you combine that with other metrics and actually look at the full picture, it's not actually probably telling you what you thought it was saying. And
no, and look, I think this is a great, spend the whole podcast just talking about this, because I think when most retailers have been set up functionally, and there's a buying function, a merch function, supply chain, marketing, digital. And up until a point, what happens in these businesses is you take high-level objectives and you cascade them down into sort of functional objectives, and then the functional leads do the best job they can to say, okay, well, then what are the right metrics to optimize my bit of the jigsaw puzzle? And then I think two or three things change. The first one is, the world changes. 10 years ago, Google Shopping, or 15 years ago, Google Shopping didn't exist. Marketing could optimize pretty independently from merchandising. But as the landscape changes, those, optimization that made sense in the past stops making sense, number one. Number two is, we've got data we've never had before. In the past, this data was not captured or expensive to capture. We've now able to sort of what I would call sort of instrument the business in a way that simply wasn't possible in the past. And I think thirdly, the business challenges are very different. Again, in the past, retail was very profitable. They were growing, they were expanding. Optimizing to the last, pound of digital marketing spend, it just was not a priority. But as the world changes, as we get more data, as the competitive pressures sort of increase, And I think that data transparency is really the first step to that, is at least getting each silo to understand the consequences on the other parts of the business is a really good starting point. And, I think a lot about what I would call guardrail metrics that then, the digital marketing colleagues, they can be optimizing, but they need guardrails that help them not create problems or ensure they're solving the right problem downstream for merchandising and vice versa. So I think there is, really key, we're at a really interesting point in retail where I think that the next generation of metrics and management and sort of how you understand performance and continually optimize these sort of complex end-to-end processes is a really interesting and difficult management challenge.
Yeah, we were having a conversation earlier today, actually, and talking about kind of just how actually the data transparency you're talking about is just such a powerful communication tool cross-functionally within businesses as well, and connecting them together to ensure that you ultimately are making the right decisions for the business at a total level.
I think creating that sort of culture of data transparency is incredibly powerful if one can get it right.
Yeah. And I think as well, it's interesting to reflect on that, not just internally within an organization, but an organization with its partners as well. And,
yes.
We know that a lot of our customers will use our market intelligence to actually kind of have more effective conversations and collaborate with whether that's their wholesale partners or the brands that they work with. We've had examples of customers or suppliers have been asked to offer a cost price reduction because a product's maybe not performed or met expectations. And they're actually able to use the market intelligence data to actually challenge them on that and say, actually, no, this is one of your top performing products. And, ultimately that saved them a huge amount of money because they've been able to use that data to support their business case and, maybe offer alternative lines or other areas in which that they can.
I think it's a very good point, because I think what you see is historically, as I said, many businesses sort of see this sort of information is power and hold information very, very tightly. I think what you can see is that, it's clear that there is some data that retailers are sitting on that is obviously sensitive and proprietary and gives them a huge competitive advantage. But equally, there's a lot of data, particularly, say, supply chain data, where actually you get massive efficiencies through collaboration through the supply chain. And so I think that is a really interesting, again, strategic challenge for retail leaders who might historically have said, no, we don't share any data with any partners ever. That's our sort of secret sauce, to actually say, look, we can be a bit cleverer about this. There's data that is clearly stuff that we need to keep very close to our chest, but there's equally data where there's more value in sharing it than there is in holding it ourselves. I think it's really interesting.
Totally. Well, Michael, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for joining. And I think one thing we always ask any of our guests is, what is the one thing that you would love our listeners to take away from this episode? What would you like to?
Well, the one thing I'd love them to take away, it's a great question. I'm not even sure I talked about it, but I think the one thing I would like them to take away is the distrust of averages. I think one of the things I see in this sort of the world that we're in now, this sort of atomized digital world, whether you're talking about customers, whether you're talking about products, whether you're talking about digital marketing on Google, averages are the enemy. And so I think that the opportunities to sort of think differently all stem from beginning to sort of de-average your business and start to look at the world. My analogy is, it's like you want to look at the world through a microscope, and everyone has been looking at the sort of retail world, which, to be honest, was the right way. Historically, retail was broad strokes. You looked at stores, you looked at categories, but you now need to look at your business as if it was under a microscope, because the opportunities in this sort of digital world are at that much more level.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michael. That was fantastic. Thank you for joining me. As a listener of ours, we are here to support you throughout 2021. If you're a customer of Edited, please contact your dedicated account manager and retail strategist, and they'll do everything they can to support you. For all of our listeners, ensure you're subscribed to our insider briefing. You can sign up at edited.com, where we'll be keeping you all updated on the latest news and strategies. If you've enjoyed today's conversation with Michael, please make sure you subscribe to keep in the loop with future episodes. And we would love it if you could tell your friends or family about us. And if you have any further questions, you can get in contact at unedited@edited.com or tweet us at edited_HQ. Thanks. Bye.